Fidelio's webinar, The Art and Aspiration of Section 1721 Reporting. I should say this is by popular demand. It's very topical currently in the UK, and I hope will demonstrate internationally as well. And Amy, if we could perhaps look to the next chart. Those of you who are familiar with Fidelio will know that we're a specialised board development agency. We work through strategy and purpose, composition and effectiveness. Building better boards is what we do, and I would say that Section 1721 is very much on the board agenda currently. Very evidently, as we look at board effectiveness through board evaluations and board development modules, we're seeing that boards are really thinking through what this requirement means for them. And I think the FRC report this week commented that a number of boards are undertaking modules dedicated to this subject, and we've certainly contributed there. But also composition, and we're certainly seeing that this whole topic of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder accountability is very much shaping the board skill matrix, and it's beginning to flow through into board appointments as well. And I'd like to move to the next chart, please, Amy. If we look at quite a recent article by Dame Vivian Hunt of McKinsey, this really makes the point very, very clearly that if we're taking stakeholder accountability seriously, and if boards want to earn the trust of key stakeholders, composition absolutely matters, both in terms of who sits on the board and how they're appointed to the board. And I think we would absolutely endorse that this is a trend that we're seeing as well at Fidelio. Next chart, please. But we're also seeing throughout the leadership grid, as we call it, every lever available to the board is being impacted by Section 172 and the consideration of stakeholders, whether it's purpose and value, strategy, clearly decision making, and that issue of trade-offs, composition, remuneration, risk, and engagement. At every stage, we're seeing that boards are thinking through and being confronted with the realities of Section 1721. And that really prompted us today to reach out and invite Beatriz Araujo, and I know I've mispronounced your surname, so apologies for that, to join us. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with Bea on a couple of occasions previously, and around climate change and on our Seat at the Table programme. And Bea is a partner at Baker McKenzie, I know known to many of you, also head of the Corporate Governance Group, and doing extremely interesting work with the World Economic Forum on governance on an international basis. And so we're delighted to welcome Bea to help us think through the implications of Section 1721 for UK boards and beyond. And next chart, please. Just to warm everybody up today, Bea suggested a poll, and perhaps if we could move to the poll, we're asking, who do you as a director owe your duties to? Is it the shareholders, A, B, the company, C, society, D, employees, E, other? So please do go ahead and vote. I'm not sure that we're actually allowed to vote as, we are actually as panelists as well. So I'll invite my fellow panelists to vote as well. And let's wait just a couple of seconds for the voting to come through. So Bea, there we go. 31% for, I think
interesting.
52% for the company, 3% society, 0 to employees, and 14% to other. And that might be something that we can delve down into a little bit in the course of the webinar. I should say that we have an hour today, and I'm going to kick off by asking Bea some questions, and then we'll absolutely allow plenty of time for questions from the floor. And so I would ask, do please send your questions by the Q&A function, and we'll make sure that we answer as many as possible in the course of the webinar. So if we can move to the next chart, please. My first question for Bea is really going back to basics. I mean, I've been talking quite deliberately in a very sort of superficial, high level way about Section 1721. But Bea, can you take us right back to the origins, the 2006 Companies Act? What was it originally intended to achieve? Can you give us some context there, please? And if we could perhaps move that as well.
Sure, Gillian, and thank you very much for having me, and hello to everyone who's joined. Very happy to be with you. So going back a bit in history, in the 90s, those of us who are old enough to remember, we had the DTI then, the Department of Trade and Industry. They set up a company law steering group to look critically at many aspects of company law, which was at the time already regulated under an act, the Companies Act 1985. I actually joined the profession just before that act. After much deliberation, it produced a modern company law for competitive economy, the final report, having taken evidence from a wide range of interests and experts as to how they could improve company law. It was felt that existing company law was full of unnecessary rules, confusing for company directors, and not wholly conducive to the setting up of businesses or retaining businesses in the UK. And that political aspect, I think, is an important one to bear in mind. Many sort of uncontroversial, sensible and worthwhile reforms were made, but there were some that were also seen as controversial. And the one that was at the time possibly the most controversial was Section 172, which was introduced in the Companies Act 2006. This section sought to move the law away from the classic view that the paramount concern of directors was to maintain shareholder value, that directors were not obliged to take anything else into account except insofar as it benefited the company and thereby indirectly the shareholders. In short, directors weren't expected in their management of the company to display any particular sense of social responsibility. And this is sort of in line with what we're seeing at the moment, a debate in the US around shareholder primacy and stakeholder capitalism, which maybe we come back to a bit later. Those in favor of Section 172 took the view that, a wider view that although directors should act in a way that benefits shareholders, they should in the process positively take into account other stakeholders in the company and should act in a thoughtful, inclusive way, looking to the future, considering the implications of their decisions for customers, creditors, employees, local community, shareholders generally, as opposed to any favored group of shareholders, and also to establish a reputation for high standards of business conduct. So the essential duty of directors was to promote the success of the company and in the process to have regard to these various requirements. This was said to lead to enlightened shareholder value, which is what Section 172 has come to be known, because directors who did this in the long run would create favorable conditions for the long-term prosperity of the company itself, its shareholders and its employees. The section attracted controversy for many reasons once it was introduced, mainly because from a lawyer's point of view, it can be seen as vague and confusing. For example, it's not clear how much regarding of stakeholder interests is necessary and how it should be evidenced. What does promote success of the company mean? Success isn't defined. There's some guidance in the reference to long-term increase in value, which is determined by reference to a director's good faith judgment. An English question can question good faith, where a decision is not one of a reasonable and diligent director. The fact that it anchors a duty in the best interests of the company means you do need to consider present and future shareholders, which indicates there's a need to balance short-term and long-term interests. And as I mentioned earlier, this having regard to requires directors to consider factors, the stakeholder interests, but I think under the overarching duty of promoting the success of the company. The one thing I think is accepted is that the Companies Act 2006 didn't change the fact that company directors are, provided they don't commit any outright criminal act, solely accountable to the company and its members or shareholders. So provided the board can demonstrate that concerns of various stakeholders are considered as part of a board decision, a class of stakeholders that's adversely affected by that decision has little recourse against the directors if they can't secure the support of company members and shareholders, because it's only the company or the shareholders via derivative action that can hold directors to account for breaches of Section 172. And as the lawyers in the room will know, there haven't been that many cases. So that's kind of been what's seen as its main weakness.
Thank you. And if we could perhaps, and I think that that's sort of rather controversial start. It's quite interesting how the world has moved on. And if we could move to the next question, please, Amy. We've seen that this has all been revisited in the code, in the updated Corporate Governance Code in 2018, and there was certainly reference in the recent FRC review of compliance with the code to a lot of vague, I notice your use of the word vague, a lot of vague reporting, and could you perhaps just kind of bring us up to date? How companies responded to Section 1721, why was there the need for this revisiting? And perhaps, Amy, could we just move to the next chart as well, which shows the 2018 requirements?
So as we've just discussed, Section 172 was designed to make directors in effect behave well and to be good and thoughtful people when making directorial decisions. If directors did follow the precepts of Section 172, the law could well have altered business and social behavior for the better. Then we had a number of corporate scandals over a number of years, including BHS, Carillion, Sports Direct, where there were corporate governance failings, and which were taking place just as Theresa May was seeking to become a prime minister. And she sort of stood up and said, we need to have a look at corporate governance. Section 172 suggests that the requirement for directors to have regard to these various matters has moral persuasion, but no more. Again, I sort of hinted at this before. I heard someone say it's like patting a wolf on the head and asking it to be good. This doesn't mean that the provisions of that subsection are worthless, but rather that they are in practice sanctionless and therefore can afford to be ignored. So when the BIS reviewed the effectiveness of Section 172, they commented that we have some sympathy with the argument that there are insufficient incentives for directors to consider seriously the interests of other stakeholders, such as employees, supply chains, and pension fund members. So they were picking up the various scandals. They also noted that listed companies are subject to a variety of reporting requirements relating to financial reporting and corporate governance, and that premium companies are subject to higher standards of disclosure. But they concluded that some of these reports had become increasingly defensive in nature and legalistic in tone as companies sought to adhere to minimum requirements for reporting. The evidence was very much of boilerplate statements that lacked meaning but passed the test of compliance. And it was clear that many companies were failing to communicate effectively with stakeholders via the reporting process, and therefore missing an opportunity to enhance public confidence and inform investors. Companies are not required to explain specifically how they fulfill, at that time, how they fulfill their Section 172 duties, including how they've had consideration for stakeholders while pursuing the success of the company. And as a result, it was very difficult for shareholders to hold directors to account for compliance with legal duties or understand how they balance the interest of various stakeholders in the course of the year. So the way they put it is that we're all in agreement that put at its lowest, it's very difficult to evaluate the operation of Section 172 in the absence of any real disclosures as to how it's working in practice. However, rather than amending Section 172 and giving it more teeth, which I think would have taken a long time to get through Parliament, etc., the legislator opted to introduce reporting obligations. And as you ask, how have these gone since? The Section 172 statements were due to be included for accounting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2019. So the FRC, following the review by the FRC lab of Section 172 statements in its first year of implementation, wrote to CEOs CFOs, audit committee chairs, just a couple of weeks ago or so, on 12th of November, commenting that many companies did not sufficiently explain how their directors discharged their Section 172 duty, and in particular the responsibility to have regard to the consequences of decisions in the long term. A number of companies reported on methods of engagement with stakeholders, but did not reflect a two-way dialogue or explain how the feedback affected decision making. Others treated the statement as one of compliance instead of reflecting how they specifically met with the requirements. It's not looking that good. Then on the 26th of November, the FRC, as you mentioned, wrote on its views as to how reporting under the new corporate governance code had gone. They called it a mixed picture. They said it was pleasing to see better reporting on stakeholder engagement, but that they're concerned that some companies continue to rely on reporting process rather than substance, so still ticking the box. And they highlight the need to demonstrate consideration of feedback to the board, outcomes such as influence on decision making. And in many cases, it wasn't clear how matters came into the boardroom and how they then affected decision making. I mean, to me, the way I've always summarized this new reporting requirement is that it's all about bringing the voice of the stakeholder into the boardroom, as well as obviously directors being trained and understanding their Section 172 obligations. I mean, this review allowed the FRC to set out the expectations for improvement as to what they're expecting to see in the next round. So I'm following their words here, but they say companies should provide clear and meaningful explanations of how they achieve good governance standards in line with the flexibility offered by the code. They should be clearly showing the impact of engagement with stakeholders, including shareholders, on decision-making, strategy and long-term success, a better assessment as to and monitoring of culture, including consideration of methods and metrics used, and that you see very little happening. And also demonstrating commitment to diversity and inclusion through actions such as improved succession planning and recruitment from diverse talent pools, which you alluded to earlier with your reference to composition. The FRC Lab has also published some reporting tips, and I'll just go through these very quickly, but they encourage companies to report on effectiveness and outcomes of engagement. So that, again, voice of the stakeholder in there. Oversight that boards have over delegated engagement. So how have they sort of pushed down stakeholder governance into the organization? How feedback has been used within decision-making process, and comments being made on not just the easy decisions, but also difficult decisions. And I should say that not all companies are actually reporting on decisions. They're just reporting on engagement, but not necessarily what decisions have been made, principal decisions have been made. And I think that's a nervousness because, again, principal decisions haven't been defined, although I sometimes say you know one when you see one. And then the last two recommendations is that the reporting should sort of state how stakeholders are considered strategically and how such consideration is contributing to companies' long-term success. And then the implication of decisions on both long-term success and stakeholders themselves. So they're sort of putting down a marker as to what their expectations for next round of reporting on Section 172 should look like and what should it include.
Thank you. And I think it's quite interesting that, you know, there is an encouragement around, you know, when you can't comply to explain, and also that sense of what's really going on. And we've certainly seen there's quite a broad range of how companies are responding, but clearly that interest to see, as you mentioned, be the sort of the voice of the stakeholder. And there are some companies that are doing this exceptionally well. Confidence and trust is going to be quite important because it feels a very different form of reporting. And as we started, this is changing how boards are behaving. I mean, and Vivian Hunt's point about trust, you know, there's a real interlinkage there. I'd like to move just to the last question for B, from me, that is, and that's looking beyond the UK. Now, we've obviously talked in actually quite a lot of detail about the process in the UK of bringing stakeholders into the fold. And certainly, I mean, you know, we've done quite a lot of work in Germany, for example, where some stakeholders, such as employees, have a very different role within the governance structure. But could you talk a little bit about, you know, the extent to which 1721 fits into a bigger picture in terms of board level stakeholder engagement, B?
Sure, and I think here I'll sort of share a bit sort of my journey over the past couple of years or so through the work with the World Economic Forum, because that's trying to look at this from a global perspective, which for a lawyer is very hard because you can't help thinking, but the laws are different everywhere. But in March last year, I helped publish a paper which was called The Modern Dilemma: Balancing Short-Term and Long-Term Business Pressures. And one of the conclusions reached there was that corporate governance has been and continues to be on a journey, given in part to the shifts in the balance of power, responsibility, and accountability between the various actors, namely investors, regulators, society, and business. And they were all being swept. What I was beginning to see was that they were all being swept into an era of stakeholder capitalism. I didn't realize I was coining a phrase that then became quite a loud one over the past few months. But in the 18 months or 2 years since, I guess we're getting closer to March now, much has happened, both as regards the speed at which stakeholder capitalism has taken hold in boardrooms, and of course in the world more generally. The pandemic, I think, has amplified the shifting norms of business that stakeholder activism pursues, and the imperative of moving from words to actions. There hasn't only been unprecedented change in a short time, but also more time for all to reflect. And there's a clear step change in ambition as to what is achievable on the part of everyone: governments, NGOs, investor community, business and society. And I think that the clear consensus emerging is that for a company to enjoy sustainable value creation and long-term success, it must clearly understand who its key stakeholders are, engage with them, and bring their voice into decision making. And the way I've seen the global trend over the past couple of years is no doubt stakeholder activism. We're seeing everyone coming at it from all angles. So investors have increasingly made public commitments that they're looking more and more to companies for long-term value creation rather than short-term returns. And they understand that for companies to achieve this better stakeholder engagement, ESG is needed. I call it stakeholder governance. There are cynics in the room, I'm sure, but certainly this is a wave that is, at least the voices are out there and loud. Pandemic has made employees, customers, suppliers, and communities more activists as regards their expectation of companies. And societal activism generally is centered squarely on the increasing need for companies to have a sustainable approach to business, and that companies should contribute as much to society or the planet as they take out. And let us not forget the planet. The planet has become more of an activist in the boardroom over past years. Not paying attention to climate change, water shortage, or the diminishing biodiversity can bring much risk, but also opportunity to companies. And that's an area where I think we'll need to look at what reporting requirements will come in over the coming period. I mean, as you all hear, the talk now is of building back better, the Great Reset. And governance, being a journey, needs to be continually improved and evolved to meet the needs of the time. So now it's a bit of a look at how, we're at a bit of an intersection. How do companies address often conflicting and confusing theories? Legal theories, we're looking at Section 172, economic, stakeholder theories, and scholarly. And then on top of that, market forces. So is the purpose of a corporation simply to deliver profits to shareholders? Or is it instead taxed in such a way that builds sustainable value with broader stakeholders? Or is it something else? How can we synthesize all of this, break it down into key constituents? What are the key ingredients for a corporation's success? I mean, I tried to look at it from the perspective, what is essential to a corporation's survival? It's obviously to maintain its license to operate. And to do this, it must gain and retain the trust, as you quite rightly said, Gillian, of its material stakeholders. And those are those that can reasonably expected to be significantly affected by its activities or products and services, and also those whose actions can reasonably be expected to affect the ability of the corporation to implement its strategies and achieve its objectives, which is why I think the environment, to the extent it can impact on a business, should be seen as a stakeholder as well, even though it's not rational. And shareholders, to me, are equally stakeholders, obviously with a different role. If I were a board, there are 4 critical questions I would suggest the board ask itself. What need are we here to fulfill or serve? That's the purpose. What is our roadmap? How do we get there? That's our strategy. How do we do things here? What are our guiding principles and behaviors? the cultures and values? And then how do we ensure good decision making across the entire corporation? And that to me is where governance comes in. And I don't have as many as you have, Gillian, in your introductory slide, but I sort of tried to put it down to 4 key ingredients. So why do I look at this? Because what you then need to do is look at the impact on and of material stakeholders of the corporation, because they need to permeate each level of these ingredients. They cannot be ignored when answering each of the above questions. So when you're setting your strategy, you need to be already thinking then, what role do stakeholders have to play, rather than having that as a discussion down in HR for employees, down in somewhere else for suppliers, etc., etc. I mean, the ultimate guardian of companies' purpose, strategy, culture, values, and governance is the board. And at the heart of this comment is the fact that a director's fiduciary duty in most countries of the world is primarily to act in the best interests of the company. There are then additional nuances as to whether boards also owe duties to shareholders. In the States, that's very clear, Delaware at least, and others, and whether any of these have priority in decision making. To me, given that the legal duty is to act primarily in the best interests of the company, this arguably presupposes ensuring its long-term sustainable success, and also looking at the preponderance of economic and other studies that show that understanding the needs and expectations of those stakeholders that have been identified as material to company are critical. I think you can't avoid the sort of stakeholder capitalism theory as part of undertaking your board director duties. So I actually think that in the UK, you could say we're sort of ahead of the curve, as we have been grappling with the concept of stakeholders or enlightened shareholder value through the need to comply and now show compliance with section 172. So maybe I'll stop there, so you can tell I get a bit passionate about this.
No, that's excellent, and I mean, we see this as being an international trend, and I was very struck also by your comments on materiality. I mean, I think there is something about having the clarity of thinking and the confidence on materiality to be able to do this well. Otherwise, we often see companies on the back foot trying to respond to 100 NGOs, and much better to be clear about the materiality, as you suggested, B. I am receiving quite a lot of questions, so I'd like to at this point perhaps move over to the Q&A. So could we perhaps drop the charts, Amy, and open up the screen? And my first question is on COVID. And do you expect there will be substantial analysis by stakeholders of the different approaches and decisions taken by companies based on 1721 reporting, for example, with regard to COVID? So, B, can I ask you to kick off on that one, please? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. How many times I've been told that? There's a poll on a thing I listened to yesterday, and they said, what are the things that happen to you most on Zoom? And there's dog barking, babies interfering, or being put on mute. Most people chose the mute one, so I'm not alone. Anyway, no, COVID and reporting. This is the sort of catch-22. The more you report, the more you expose yourself to what others might think, have views on what you're doing. So underlining the reporting requirement clearly is a real need for good data to back it up, and any external assurance. So we shouldn't take the obligation to report well lightly, and I don't want to suggest that in any way. However, I do think people will be looking at reporting. I mean, we've already seen it with companies looking at how decisions are being made. I don't know if all of you remember in the early days of the pandemic in the US, a couple of CEOs dismissed 2,000 employees. So exactly same decision. Obviously the cost base was high, but one of them did it in a 2-minute Zoom call to the workforce, whilst another did it by sending in individual emails, I think, offering outplacement training, putting in place medical insurance for a period, and saying, do take your laptop with you, because I'm sure many of you couldn't afford one. Same decision, but how it was taken was clearly one was thinking about the impact of that decision on those stakeholders, on those employees. The other one just threw it out there. So I think you do need to be mindful of the hard decisions have to be made, but also how you make them is probably more going to be analysed than what the decisions are, is my guess, Gillian. But we'll see. I guess this will be an interesting area to watch.
And I think, well, both with regard to the S and being a good employer, but with regard to the environment as well, and that whole question of greenwashing is something we're going to be picking up at the risk that boards might run in terms of what they say, what they don't say.
Absolutely.
Is going to be enormously important. And that leads to, I have another question, and I'll read it because it's quite a precise question. For some stakeholders mentioned, for example, in particular the environment, it's very clear who the law would recognise as relevant interlocutors on those interests. It could be claimed by Greenpeace or DEFRA or planning authorities. Is it the impact on the company that decides who's relevant? So perhaps going back to your materiality analysis, Bea.
Yeah, I think I'm understanding the question in terms of who's going to stand up for the environment in the boardroom. Is that the question? I mean, I think what you need to do is look at your operations, look at, for example, if you need a lot of water to run your operations, you've got a manufacturing facility which consumes loads of water to produce your widgets. I think you need to be asking yourself the question, water is becoming an increasingly scarce resource over the next decade too. I don't know the science behind it. What steps should this is a risk for me and for my business. What steps should I be starting to take now to work out how to deal with that when it comes? I mean, the example I always like is the hotels in the Maldives. How long are they going to be operational, given the science telling us that climate change means the ocean's going to go up many centimeters in that part of the world regularly? So with the environment, I think generally you need to think more of, at least this is the way the TCFD looks at it, what risks does it present to us as a business? I think equally you're asked to consider what opportunities does it present to us as a business. So if I can show that I consume a lot of water, but I'm now going to use that water again and again and again, so I'm not depleting the earth of water, that may be a good avenue to pursue. I mean, we're seeing the energy world completely transforming in front of us at the moment, with statements of becoming net zero by 2050 by the likes of BP, Shell and others. They're clearly taking climate risk seriously. They're taking societal views seriously. They're taking the likelihood of regulation around committing to net zero very seriously. So a lot of influences are pushing them to look at that. And at the end of the day, you're looking after your employees who want to work in certain types of companies, maybe that uphold certain values. Or you may be looking at the environment and what impact it's going to have on your business. So what's difficult here is that there's not a cookie cutter approach to it. Each business needs to dig deep. That's why I always say it starts with purpose, then you go on to strategy and your culture and values, and then make sure your governance framework helps you achieve that. That's how I've sort of simplified it in my little mind. But I don't know, I hope I've answered the question.
Hardly a little mind. And I think probably there's also judgment on who the interlocutors are. It's also for the company to form a judgment on,
yes,
on the relevant interlocutors. Alistair, I just wondered, was there anything that you would like to add on that materiality and purpose and that linkage between creating that clear pathway that Bea set out?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're finding, and it really reflects what you've been saying, Bea, on this, is that purpose is a very useful tool for boards to actually try and internalize some of the thinking that 172 requires and that ESG requires, and it gives them a framework to start off that process of saying, okay, let's start with purpose, and then around that build the strategy, and then around that build the other, ensure that the board is operating in order to deliver those. And we have this tool which Gillian referred to earlier, called the leadership grid, which is effectively a diagnosis looking at all of the levers you have available on the board and how you can align how they all work. And part of that's composition, part of that is how you run your various different committees and things. So I think that's a good way for boards to get around it. And just referring back, you were talking about the latest FRC report. There was quite a sort of undertone of that there's still quite a lot of box ticking and compliance mentality around that. And what we're finding, I think, within our clients is that a lot of boards want to move in the direction of actually living Section 172 or living ESG, but it is a difficult process. It's not an easy transition from the kind of decision-making processes they're used to one that really brings stakeholders sort of center stage and really incorporates the stakeholder perspectives and the stakeholder needs into those processes. And I think there's quite a lot of willingness out there, but many boards find that really hard. And what we're finding is that people are coming to us to help us sort of structure the way they think in order to try and put that all together. I would hope anyway in the next round of the governance reporting review will show a big improvement in terms of boards actually walking the talk rather than just kind of desperately trying to report something that complies with the regulations.
And I guess the confidence about reporting. I mean, I think it's quite seeing some of the things that the FRC is recommending that are reported upon quite openly, whereas I think traditionally boards would have felt perhaps that hesitant about putting that into the annual report in the public domain.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Now, I have quite a lot more questions coming in. So one question is really about the role of the chair. And B, I wonder if you could address this question about how involved should the board and particularly the chair be with major shareholders, in particular with regard to ESG, so engagement on sort of ESG issues, without treading on the toes of the management team. And I think this probably comes also from taking into account maybe a two-tier board structure rather than a unitary board. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I actually think the chair should play quite a big role here. If we can sort of separate the chair from the CEO, say, put it in that context. I think the chair should own the long-term agenda in some ways, to explain to shareholders what the longer-term aspirations of the company are, and what the stakeholder governance structure is going to be to achieve that. So ESG, I would see the chair as playing that role as to why certain decisions are important. If the example, I'm not going to lay off 1,000 employees because in 6 months I need them all back and I won't be able to hire them, so bear with me a bit longer. I don't know, that kind of a conversation. I think the chair does need to take some ownership of that personally, and I've spoken through the work I've been doing with the World Economic Forum to a lot of chairs in a lot of jurisdictions, and there some countries might take issue with me on making this comment, but if you're really going to have that sort of holistic approach, and the board is being seen as having oversight over the stakeholder governance approach of the company, I think the chair or another director with that responsibility should to some extent own that conversation. That doesn't mean to the exclusion of management or stepping on their toes. The direction is kind of set by the board. The oversight needs to be there by the board. And then management needs to execute and come back with any changes of direction that might be needed. So it's a symbiotic relationship. But the challenge for the chair is being well informed by management, and I think to really do this job well, boards need to find ways that they can bring that, again, I've got to come back to bringing the voice of the relevant stakeholders back into the boardroom, really understanding what is happening there. So that the information flow there needs to be far more effective to ensure that the board can do its role. But from everyone you talk to, investors more and more are asking these questions. And when I wrote the first paper, I mean, I'm the second paper about to release, but the 18 so months ago, I was very much being told, oh no, they ask as an afterthought, once the CEO's been through all the financials, they might say, oh, how's your board diversity? Or a couple of questions, someone sitting in a corner. The sense I'm getting is that that is changing. Even the voices, obviously, in the press with Larry Fink and BlackRock, etc., are much louder, but I think that's also translating into the approaches. In fact, to the point where boards are being or companies are being driven completely bananas, because each investor will have its own ESG checklist. Each ratings agency is going to rate them on ESG on their own basis. So there's a bit of a Wild West going out there at the moment around how you talk about these things. Not all of them you're required to talk about, but you're being asked about. And that, I think, is the sort of next trend as to how all this ESG reporting gets a bit better aligned and converged. Absolutely. Sorry, it's a long answer to a short question.
A great answer. And I think, you know, it's really incumbent on companies to have their own voice, because if they don't have their own voice, others will be defining what they are saying. And I think that goes back to your point about materiality. I'd like to raise a question for Bea and then Alistair on, which we've touched upon very lightly, trade-offs. We've had a question, and I know the FRC has been very explicit about they want kind of boards to be open and transparent about, you know, there will be conflicts of interest. There will be times when one stakeholder has to be prioritized over another. So perhaps starting with Bea, your thoughts on how boards handle those trade-offs in the context of Section 1721.
Yeah, people sort of talk about this being a balancing act and having to choose one over other. It's not as simple as that. What you're required to do is have all that information to hand, look at it, and then decide what's the best course of action for the company, essentially in the long term, although obviously the decisions you make are going to have short-term implications as well. So I, you know, like I'm not allowed to be on a board, so I guess that, I might say to myself, thankfully I'm not, because the decisions can be quite difficult. But I kind of go back to the example of those two CEOs letting go 2,000 people. A difficult decision had to be made. Well, one thing I would notice is that the conversation from investors, if you read the press in the past 10 months or so, you really don't hear them talking so much about returns anymore. They're talking about value creation. And I think that has a different lens for them. So, I mean, I'm sure people in the room will say it's ridiculous. They still want as big a profit as quickly and high dividends. But certainly their language is changing, which I think gives boards a bit more wriggle room in terms of how they make these decisions. But you sort of need all that information and then use your best judgment to make the right decision by factoring all that information in. It isn't sort of, oh, I've got to do this and I've got to do that. It's, I've got these two tensions. If I look at the company and the directions going, how am I best going to manage those? And they'll be give and take in some ways. I'm sure I've not answered the question at all, because it's a really difficult question.
It's a tough one, and I guess it goes to the matter. Yeah.
But you're not forced to make one or the other choice. It's a bit more nuanced than that, I guess, is the answer.
Thank you. Alistair, is there anything you'd like to add on?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you answered that one first, because it is incredibly difficult. And well, I mean, one of the things actually that we find that you've got to help boards through is the idea that you know that there are going to be trade-offs, and people are going to, you know, some of their material stakeholders are going to be disadvantaged by decisions. And I think you referred to the layoff thing, and that's the example that we often use, of saying, you know, if you do have to make a decision in terms of the long-term value of the company, if you're going to have to, you know, disadvantage employees or perhaps the communities in which you're shutting down factories, whatever it is, you've got to think about doing that in a way that is aligned with the values that you state for your company. And that keeps that kind of license to operate there, because people, when push comes to shove, they do realize that you have to make difficult decisions. And so you can't always, you know, living in an ESG world is not always doing nice things to people around you. It's about making these decisions which are tougher than they used to be, because you have to think of a lot of different kind of perspectives in that, but you have to make them and then think about, okay, is there something we can do which will ameliorate the impact on people that are suffering, in order normally to align with something that you mentioned, which is setting values for your company. And once you've got your purpose and your strategy, the values by which you operate and make those decisions are another really, really important element. But having said that, I'm feeling like, I'm kind of saying it's all really very difficult and there's no real easy answers.
Yeah, I was going to mention one additional point that we should make, may come up or may not, but in these difficult times, the one thing boards should also be mindful of, as if they didn't have enough, is that if your company is financially coming to a distressed position, you need to remember that there's a sort of moment when your duties move from Section 172 considerations to creditors. Yeah. And that brings in a different mindset to some extent. So, if we have the luxury of having been able to make these decisions when we're a company that's doing reasonably well, that's one thing. But if you have the sort of shadow of insolvency creeping close to you, you need to keep an eye on that as well, because your duties will, at some point during that shift to being doing what's in the best interest of creditors, which then becomes a different ball game. So I just should say that for sake of completeness. Hopefully that's not the case for anyone that's listening.
Very good point.
A very good point. And I think perhaps the other manifestation of this in the current environment is we've seen companies taking furlough and then perhaps repaying the furloughs, and that's a classic sort of case perhaps of thinking through the trade-offs of around complex issues, or the dividend versus furlough. Now I'd like to sort of put together a couple of questions, and these are for B. One, has there been any material contrast between the way private and public companies have responded to Section 1721? And then I've also received a question about kind of implications for not-for-profit organisations, and perhaps a word to, I know we have a number of people who are sitting on non-profit boards, and sort of the implications of Section 1721 there. So B.
Doing it again. Luckily my computer told me this time before you got in there. Between public and private companies, sort of the throwing up your hands in horror and saying, oh, do I really have to do this, I think is universal. When it first came out, I always feel that the legislators sort of turning the tables on the you're innocent until proven guilty by dealing with everything through reporting, because they're asking companies to put up their store and then be shut down for it. So I think there's a slight move there, because we've had so many new reporting requirements for all kinds of companies. But anyway, I think everyone sort of looks at it and says, oh God, this will require more resource and more attention. And many companies are doing things absolutely well, and this is really out there to catch the bad apples in the cart. I mean, smaller companies are taking it as seriously. We're helping a lot of very large companies do this, including the very, very large that need to do governance statements. And I think there's a difference of resource sometimes. The bigger the company, the bigger a company secretariat department they have, so the better time they can engage, the more organized their board meetings are, because they're subject to the code anyway. So there's a sort of resource differential, but that's the main thing I would say. I mean, for not-for-profits, resource is even shorter there, but until last summer I chaired a LATAM, a canning house, and certainly for the period I did that, I did bring in some Section 172 practices, making sure that we had a copy of Section 172 in our board papers. I mean, there you don't have the challenge of shareholders wanting profit. You're there to pursue your not-for-profit goals and aspirations, but you do have employees, you do have suppliers, potentially some customers, members. So I think in that respect, you should try and apply it and have your board familiar with it in any event. But I don't act for many not-for-profits, so there may be nuances there that I might be missing.
Thank you, and I'm keeping an eye on the time, but certainly like to get this question in. You mentioned the stewardship code and the changing behaviour of investors, and we've received a question that the stewardship code requires a lot more reporting. The 2020 stewardship code requires a lot more reporting on ESG issues by investors. Is this really likely to deliver a reprioritisation of other stakeholders over shareholders, particularly in the event of conflict between profit and ESG actions? So I guess if we've got a seesaw, are we really seeing that sort of the sort of the stakeholders kind of really gaining weight, or are we still dancing around the edges of this?
Yeah, I think time will still tell. But funnily enough, I mean, that paper I published last year with the WEF, I had 3 conclusions. I shared one with you. Another one was that what was driving short-termism, as I saw that there was a sort of conflict between investors and what they were trying to achieve for their clients and the duties directors owed to their companies, assuming directors are, you know, engaging as they should. So forever there's going to be that tension. And what's been really interesting is that the 2020 Stewardship Code has sort of moved from a code which says investors will have policies. Good, I've got a policy, let's do it. They're actually being required to engage more in a better way with boards on pushing directors to comply with the Section 172 duties. So there's like a perfect storm there in some ways. And for them, the difficulty investors that they now have to report on what the outcomes of that engagement is. So I guess through voting, through conversations with the boards, they can help deliver some of the change. Now, to do that, they need to be well informed by boards as to what the key stakeholders of or material stakeholders of the particular companies are, what those stakeholders are telling the board, how the board sees their importance and what impacts they might have. So hopefully, if everything moves in the direction it should, this should end up with things being a bit more sort of aligned than perhaps they were in the past.
And almost certainly
more work for investors, but it's what, you know, it's walking the talk. There's a lot of talk here, so this is sort of pushing a bit to the walk as well, I guess.
But equally, as you say, the funds under management with an ESG wrap or label, or are increasing very substantially, and I have to say we're seeing this flowing through not just public companies but also to influencing sort of private companies and private equity as well. So and I think probably we've talked about investors and stakeholders, but probably government is also almost certainly going to be playing a much larger role as we come out of COVID, and that's certainly going to be a stakeholder that companies will absolutely. I mean, we've seen how influential government can be in terms of the survival of a company, so that's clearly going to probably play a more prominent role in the next round of Section 172 reporting. I am sort of conscious of the time, and I'd like to thank you very much for taking us right through from sort of inception to current day, and also I think shining a light on a positive future and a way through this complexity. I mean, I think both you and Alistair kind of emphasise that need to find linkage between purpose and strategy, and that drives that materiality, because without it, I think companies are very much on the back foot in terms of stakeholders and Section 172 reporting. So many thanks. And Amy, if we could just wrap up with the final charts, please. So just to wrap up, we've got I took the liberty of assuming some of the things that Bea would be saying, and I think we're very much in agreement. This is much more than just reporting. It's also an opportunity. I mean, yes, there's certainly a commitment, and but it's also an opportunity to align purpose, strategy, and the business model. I think it's an opportunity for voice, for the board to develop a distinctive voice. Certainly access to capital, we've talked about that quite extensively, as well as Bea mentioned, that license to operate. We're certainly seeing as well that in particular quoted companies, regulated boards that are in the sort of public domain will be subject to greater stakeholder accountability, and I think anybody who's sitting on on a utility board or a public company board does need to think that through, for example, or a financial services board. Certainly Section 1721, and I think this is, set this out, it's a tool and an opportunity to give comfort to stakeholders, to demonstrate the value that's being added, to demonstrate how decisions are being taken, and to pick through really that tricky judgment and trade-offs, which are, that's the reason that the board is there ultimately. And finally, the point that I think can be emphasised, that this has a relevance way beyond the UK, that many of the issues we may be grappling with here in the UK now are very relevant, and we're seeing those being discussed in boardrooms, certainly across Europe, but in the US as well, and more broadly. So absolutely endorse Bee's findings there, and delighted that this wonderful research is being conducted. And before we close, I'd just like to, if we could move to the next chart, to look forward. Next week, we're hosting a roundtable with Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, a D&I primer for boards in the age of COVID. There's quite a lot of evidence that much of the progress towards diversity is being challenged by remote working and some of the practices that have been adopted by as a result of COVID. And so we're looking at what the chair can be doing to ensure that progress continues. In the new year, we'll be picking up, obviously the German government has really recently announced an extension of that quota and its intention to apply it to management boards, not just supervisory boards, so quota or no quota, and the progress towards diversity in UK and German boardrooms. We'll also be picking up in February on climate change boards and the risk of greenwashing, and this was something that Bee touched upon today, but is clearly also something within Chapter 0 that we're thinking through very carefully, how boards really are alert to these dangers. And I would also encourage anybody who's not a member of Chapter 0, we'll include the details with these papers to look at joining that. And then finally in March, the next iteration of Fidelio's Seat at the Table board development programme, which will look at all aspects of board effectiveness, and Section 172 will be firmly there as well. So I'd like to thank Bee and Alistair. I'd like to thank all of you for participating, for great questions, if there's any follow-up, if we can be of support, please don't hesitate to get in touch. And we will be circulating the charts, and there is a recording today and that as well, so that you can revisit some of the material. There was a lot of material, I think, in these sections as well, so we'll be circulating that as well. So many thanks, and thanks to my co-contributors, and here's to strengthen Section 1721 reporting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gillian.